And probably many of the questions that we will discuss have been asked before.
That's right.
But,
That's right.
I think it's a great occasion, the publication of your latest book, Why Marx Was Right. It goes back to the basics in a way, and I think it would be ideal to also go to the basics of those attacks and presumptions on Marxism as well. What would, besides the economic crisis, what would be the reason behind the writing of this book?
I never know what the reason behind the writing of my books is. I mean, the obvious reason behind this one, I suppose, is, as you say, the crisis. But it wasn't. It was partly that. It was partly the feeling of the continuing relevance of Marx in a world where he seems to be so outdated. But actually, it's an interesting psychological fact that I never quite know why I start a book. I find myself in the middle of a project, and then quite often find it very hard to recall the motivating, the originating idea. Sometimes, looking back on a book I've written 10 years later, I can see more clearly what it was about than I could at the time. So there's a strange psychology of creation or of writing going on here. But certainly, I felt there was a need for a clear exposition of Marx. I tend in my books to oscillate between more specialist and more popular works. I believe very deeply in the need to popularise, and I'm rather scandalised by the fact that even left-wing critics, particularly in America, don't seem to feel the need for that impulse. I can understand that younger people who are still making their way in academia don't have the freedom to do that, but I do have the freedom to do it. I think it's politically very important to try and communicate those ideas.
And I think that goes, and you've mentioned it before, in frontal attack with postmodernism, in the way most of postmodernism, and you discuss it in Figures of Dissent, especially talking about Paul de Man and the inverted commas that seem to be so obscure.
Yes.
That lacks the not only the clarity but the functionality of transmitting ideas.
Yes. Academics talking to academics. It's just that I think that when it comes to left wing, to radicals, political radicals, that isn't good enough. One needs to reach. I'm always very pleased to try and reach a wider audience. I mean, some of the best responses I had to literary theory, for example, were really from people who had never seen the inside of a university. Just wanted to know what was going on. But it's interesting that if one does that, one often gets accusations from some fellow academics of dumbing down. I think that George Bernard Shaw once said, if a job is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. With a twist on the usual slogan. And I think that if you can communicate some vital ideas at the cost of a certain simplification, it's probably worth doing that, as long as the reader's aware of that. After all, that's what a lot of teaching is about. In a sense, that's what I would be doing if I were teaching undergraduates here.
If we had to apply this sort of a reconsideration of Marxist ideas through history, to apply them to the contemporary financial and, crisis in general, there would be maybe 3 cases in which maybe you could talk a little bit about how Marxism or Marxist ideas were applied to the situation. One would be in Latin America, another one in Spain, and another one in Europe in general. Maybe I can begin with Latin America, based on your ideas in the book. You mentioned that to build socialism in wretched economic conditions, you're very likely to end up with some species of Stalinism. Or perhaps you might discover that you are sitting on the largest oil field on the planet and use this to build up your economy in a democratic way, which I guess is resonant of the Venezuelan case. My question would be, in the case of Venezuela and also China, who seem to be prospering in this way, do these 2 countries or the application of Marxism define socialism today?
I don't think either of them do, really, for very different reasons. China, for the obvious reason that its economy has become increasingly capitalistic, and that communism or socialism is more of a political phenomenon in China, which is to say, it may exemplify a certain future for capitalism, combining an authoritarian state with a capitalist economy, as we've seen in some of the Southeast Asian countries and so on. There should be a fear that that's one way in which we might develop. You know, that's to say, the more that capitalism gets into economic trouble, the more politically authoritarian it may become, and that's one reason why China retains, as it were, a communist superstructure, but increasingly a capitalist base. South America is a different question. I'm no kind of expert there, but again, there's a danger, isn't there, that what one might call genuine democratic socialism can become a form of authoritarian socialism, which is managing the economy in a different kind of way. You know? But there is, of course, a very interesting general phenomenon now of, in a place like Venezuela or other places, of the conjunction of the most advanced and the most backward. This is a classic postmodern, if you like, phenomenon. I think what happens to societies that leap from a very traditional background into a more advanced capitalist economy without actually having passed through the intermediate stage that Europe has, for instance. You know, in a sense, Ireland, which is where I come from, exemplifies that to some extent, not as starkly, let's say, as some Latin American countries, but Ireland never had to go through. Ireland leapt from a peasant economy to a high-tech one, and is now in deep danger of being bankrupted in an extraordinarily short length of time. It's possible to go through a kind of time loop in that sense, which I think is very postmodern, where you squeeze out the long era of liberal, industrial, laissez-faire capitalism through which Europe had to go. There are some benefits in that, but there are also, as always, some disadvantages, because you then very often don't have the developed liberal polity, you know, that one needs.
And in the case of Ireland, it's even more poignant, since it was this booming economy in Europe. And it was one of the first.
It's hard to say to distort Marx. It's hard to say whether it's tragedy or farce. For the first time in its history, it became affluent. It actually became at one point more affluent than its previous owners, than Britain. This, among other things, induced an enormous identity crisis, which I think is an interesting cultural dimension of this whole process. There were deep and fundamental debates about what the society was. Was it going to end up just looking like another Switzerland? Was there a way, as the left was arguing, in which it could draw upon its colonial past, its solidarity with dispossessed nations, in some interesting kind of way? But alas, even before the debate was concluded, it became largely irrelevant as the whole situation imploded. It was a kind of casino capitalism. It was the kind of thing that can happen to a society, again, to go back to my previous point, that hasn't developed long-term the kind of civil institutions, the kind of general ideological climate within which you can manage this sudden economic upsurge. It was rather like, a lavatory cleaner winning the lottery.
which in a way could be shared with many other European nations in terms of, I'm thinking that that's connected to my next issue, the fallacy, or if we could apply this word, of the European Union.
Sorry, say that again.
The fallacy of the economic European Union in terms of economy. I'm not saying in terms of culture, which I myself benefited. I was able to apply and be given and being granted travel grants and However, in the economic sort of field, Europe and the European countries maybe put into practice the superstructure and base debate, in which Germany in France being more
yes,
advanced economically,
yes,
conditioned.
capitalism has good reasons to move into more and more corporate transnational forms, and that was one of the original impulses behind the EU. But at the same time, it has to take account of the fact that there are different national capitals are at very different stages, and that's going to be a contradiction within it. There's a certain economic necessity for it to become more and more corporate. At the same time, that itself creates divisions and tensions. There's a contradiction there. There's also the problem, culturally speaking, of whether, you see, as I've said before, people might throw themselves on the barricade shouting "Long live France," but they're not likely to shout "Long live the European Union." Can a coagulation of different national cultures achieve the kind of ideological or cultural, but the lived solidarity that might be necessary, say, at times of political crisis? You know?
And the crisis, especially what you mentioned, unveiled a deep capitalist problem of how to handling the rescue of other countries sharing the same currency.
Yes.
How the Central European Bank pretty much behaved as Wall Street, buying debt from certain countries, and
sure.
So I guess it would be at least economically speaking more of a pure radical capitalist system than more.
Yes, I think so. The problem, in a part, of course, one can't speak only about the problem within Europe, but about the West also confronting an external enemy in radical Islam, which, of course, has been very much exaggerated in some ways. But the fact that it also needs a certain sort of transnational unity for those reasons, and that what we're getting at the moment is a kind of quarrelling among capitalist nations, is fractions and frictions and so on. But also, if you put that in a more global context, at a point where, you know, the question is, what could be the basis of Western unity in the face of an enemy that certainly doesn't have that kind of problem itself, really? You know, it has a far too absolutist and fundamentalist notion of its own identity. It's another way of putting the problem I've written about before, which is namely that we live in a world where, at the same time, there's too little identity and too much, or you know, as I put it sometimes, there's too little belief in the West and too much the belief somewhere elsewhere, and these keep bouncing off each other.
And it's even the more sad, if one might say, that certain governments, such as the case of Spain, and that have a socialist government that was unable to cope with the forces of capitalism. And as today, the voters' polls and several statistics show that the socialist government in Spain will be changed by a conservative.
Yes.
Which probably won't change much.
Yes, it's another illustration of the point I think I make in the book about Marx, that what's helping to discredit or weaken socialism is not that it's irrelevant, but that capitalism is so powerful. In a sense, the paradox is that because capitalism is so formed and powerful, socialism is even more relevant, but is on the back foot. You know.
And speaking a little bit more about Spain, I don't know if you're familiar with the events that happened in late spring and during the summer about the Real Democracy Now movement that occupy not only Madrid's downtown, most important public square, but also other cities, and also in Greece, and a little bit in Italy, and right now in Wall Street. There's young people there. And these demonstrations, this sort of a grassroots actions, share with Marxism the distrust for parliament democracies, totally, I would say, hijacking, but monopolizing democracy. And I was wondering if in the case of Spain, even if these movements, I'm talking about real democracy, the first thing they do, which is a very traditional way of doing things, is detaching themselves from Marxism. Marxism exudes revolution, chaos, and so forth.
Yes.
They detach themselves from any denomination. In your opinion, are these grassroots organizations the closest interpretation of Marxism today? Or
I think that they're an interesting challenge to Marxism, and sometimes I think they reject it. What they're rejecting is a rather stereotypical view of Marxism, that partly because, understandably, these young people have come up through a political period where that kind of knowledge and activity hasn't been available to them. They're not like the generation of the 60s or whatever, which at least was able to know about those things. But I think that at the same time they pose an important question mark, say, to traditional Marxist ideas, ways of organising. My own son is in London, part of the, what do they call it, I can't remember the name of it, the grassroots, quite a successful grassroots, the one that confronts businesses who don't pay tax.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they're a peaceful, movement. They do sit-ins and so on, but they've been quite effective in drawing attention to themselves. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that Marxism prescribes any particular form of social organisation in this way. I think it can always learn from that. There is, I don't, as I say in the Marx book, I don't see a hard and fast distinction there between, if you like, revolutionism and reformism. I mean, I think that's really not very helpful in this situation.
Mm-hmm. And it could be, I remember while reading The Gatekeeper when you mentioned that when you try to join the party, the first thing they ask is, are you a reformist or a revolutionary?
Oh, yeah.
would these grassroots movements more interested or maybe in praxis towards reform than revolution?
Well, maybe, but there are aspects of those grassroots movements that call themselves anti-capitalist, aren't they? Mm-hmm. It's not so much a difference. I sometimes say that, people sometimes say, that Marxism is dead, and I say, well, actually what's happened is a movement from Marxism to anti-capitalism, which is hardly a huge movement. Different ways of conceiving of the same problem, I think, really.
Mm-hmm. Another aspect that it's very interesting and I think polemic in your book is the one of the critiques to Marxism. You divide the book in stereotypes, as you say, and then justification or clarification. Is the supposed apathy of the working class,
right?
And maybe also the disenchantment of most of the working class towards Marxism.
Yes.
People who feel content with their condition or bereft of hope are not likely to launch revolutions. The bad news for socialists is that people will be extremely reluctant to transform the situation as long as there is still something in that situation for them.
Right.
But people may also fear Marxism, then again, maybe the conception of it, or a stereotypical conception of Marxism. People may also fear that Marxism's gradual connivance with capitalism or contact, let's put it that way, will result in a sense of betrayal, such as the case of trade unions.
Yes. Well, I think you see that people who reject Marxism on those grounds reject it as part of, for the same reasons that they reject official capitalist politics. As you were implying there, it's an apathy towards certain formal, institutional, organised kinds of politics that they feel have let them down, whether they're parliamentary, as in the case of liberal capitalist politics, or not. So I think that Marxism has to see that there's a kind of breaking with that whole mould of politics, and that, in other words, not to question that there's apathy and disenchantment, but to look more closely and more precisely at the nature of it. What is it disenchantment with, given the fact, as I go on to argue in the book, that as soon as a kind of politics impinges on people's everyday lives, they can get very involved in them.
Until the point where there's a hospital in the neck with that.
So they try and throw them out of their gypsy camps, or whatever it is. That is what is so stupid about a certain right-wing argument about apathy. that there is evidence before their eyes that what the apathy is about are specific modalities of politics. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Maybe towards that sort of a consciousness of the problem or the apathy or what causes that is the concept of education. Mm-hmm. And that's something I was reading the book and putting myself sort of in the origin of Marxism or when Marxism appeared, and the working class then and now, it doesn't to have this thing in common towards education. Even if the mid to late 19th century there wasn't the possibility of achieving education for most of the working class. Yeah. Now it's quite the opposite. However, there's still that distance between working class and education. Is that so much abundance now?
Yes.
That maybe because of the technological revolution, people are better off just watching TV, being sedated.
Yeah, but also I think because you've got to look at the question of education like everything else within a wider social context, don't you? And the question is, do people feel that the system that they're being educated into is really theirs, is really for them, really has an ultimate place for them? Respects their own experience and so on. I think a lot of important questions there. Why the dropout rate and the apathy of otherwise quite intelligent working class students?
Exactly.
So you have to look at it within the context of a whole cultural climate, I think. Mm-hmm. What does education itself signify? What forms of authority are involved here? So,
and also, it's one thing they have in common is that the first ministries in suffering the consequences of this crisis is the Ministry of Education and Culture.
Sure.
Those are the ones, and particularly in Spain, there's been conservative or liberal, socialist or the opposite.
Yes.
The first and worst ministries is the one pertaining
it's the expendable.
Expendable, and the reforms are never for the better.
No, it also means the future is expendable, because that education stands for the future, and that's a typically capitalist form of myopia, looking at the problem as a present problem, whereas failing to invest in the future, which is what education is really about, is crazy, because it is a long-term solution. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right now there's a strike in Spain, speaking of, this week, in which the conservative local government of Madrid, the state, wanted to suspend some, essentially force teachers to teach more for less.
Yeah.
But also interesting, I think, is that they tried to award the better students, regardless their origin or background. Mm-hmm. So there's a big polemic about that. Education is not actually working because just manifesting the ideas of a lot of people, because the traditional education is not enforced in terms of discipline and aspects like that. So who's responsible for this? Oh, of course, the state in public schools. But maybe that apathy, or maybe that impression of I'm better off looking. I want to be David Beckham. Newton, in a way.
I think one aspect of it, one sign there of the crisis, is the fact that, in a sense, it's always been taken for granted that education is of great value. Even that is now coming into question. And that's a kind of new movement. People, as you say, who are saying now, I can do a lot better without it, or it's not for me, or these values aren't mine, or I wouldn't get anything out of it in the end. These are new and startling questions, really, because previously the value of education was taken for granted, and then all the questions were about now, who is it available to, who can get access to it, where does it lead, and so on. But we'll now push the question back a stage, I think.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think it's a symptom of higher education as well in universities, mostly in the United States, in which many departments of literature are dominated by postmodernist ideas, in which anything that is authoritarian, or the sense of authority, discipline, tradition, sort of Totemic aspects are seen as abhorrent.
Yes.
However, maybe people your generation or a few generations later benefit from that sort of a traditional education in a way.
Yes. It's also ironic that they see these as such people tend to see these as radical attitudes, whereas in many ways they duplicate the cultural ambiance of capitalism. You know, which again is, it's as though they think that capitalism is always authoritarian, hierarchical.
It's flexible.
Exactly. That's how it's so
highly
successful.
subjective. It can adapt very well to.
Certain sense says, do what you like. Go ahead. You know, be free. You know, be who you like. So that there's an extraordinary irony in the way that postmodernism, in reproducing part of the logic of advanced capitalism, believes it's actually turning it against it. You know? It's as though they're shadow boxing with an older form of capitalism, and they haven't recognised what has happened.
Shifting a little bit about other topic is the I was particularly impressed by chapter 6, in which you talk about the spirit, the importance of the spirit and the individual.
Yes.
And that naturally would be maybe a footnote to that attack on Marxism, that Marxism doesn't care about the spiritual dimension of the human.
A mistake about the meaning of materialism. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that could also amplify naturally to the notion of religion.
Yes.
And
yes. Although I was trying, of course, in that section to say, to avoid an identity of the spiritual and the religious, one to point out one can be spiritual without being religious. Yeah.
And it's an idea that you share, or that you also explain in the Illusions of Postmodernism, in which Marxism and indirectly Catholicism want to free man from all, in a way, material possessions and the sense of humanity and self-realization, which leads maybe, I don't know if you're that familiar with liberation theology.
Yeah.
And was that the closest thing that Marxism and religion sort of?
It was ironic that when I was involved in the Christian left in the 1960s, really, when I was at Cambridge, we actually predated liberation theology. It hadn't really happened, and if it had have happened, I think it would have been a great advantage to us, a great benefit to us, because we were trying to argue these things pretty much simply at the level of ideas. And then not long after that movement came to an end in Britain, it got off the ground in Latin America as a real political movement, as a real political force. So yes, I mean, in a sense, in a curious way, it represented, it exemplified what we had been arguing for even before it started. You know, the other point, I suppose, where in our situation religion and politics came explosively together in the early 1970s was the case of Ireland. See, and you know, so suddenly there were on the map at least two different examples of how a dialogue between Christianity and Marxism was not simply a kind of academic or specialist affair, but actually was taking on political reality.
And, well, actually, as a matter of fact, Orthodox Church survived during the Soviet Union, and so did Christian, and even all the beliefs in Cuba.
Yeah.
So it's interesting if we do what is the balance, or if it's two sides of the same problem, or you know, and also talking about the spiritual dimension of Marxism, it could be then again as a footnote or an expansion of that there's maybe an animalistic, materialistic, and the term species being that Marx talks about, and people argue that maybe that denies the divinity or transcendentalism of the human being in a post-capitalistic society.
I think one important point I was perhaps trying to make in the book was that to combat, to resist this idea of the spiritual as something, as a separate world, you know. spirituality in all the wrong senses, Madonna type spirituality, all that, a refuge from this awful world. Not that the world is too awful for her, but and to show that spirituality is simply another way of talking about human relationships and historical realities and justice and so on. To that extent, to come on to your point, no, I don't think then that is ignoring the so-called divine dimension. As I've tried to argue in my work, to talk about species being is to talk about a certain kind of body, it's to talk about what distinguishes the human body, it's to talk about its creativity and, in a certain sense, its self-transcendence, the fact that it's always going beyond its own situation. Mm-hmm. That's what distinguishes these kinds of bodies from these kinds of bodies, yeah. Mm-hmm. Now that's straight Catholic theology, if you like, that's Aquinas. But I think that there's nothing in that Marx wouldn't have understood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which I think that would represent the base. I'm talking again, base and superstructure. The base would be that conception of the human self-realization.
Yes.
That is not different from Catholicism and Marxism.
No. I mean, the spiritual in that sense is not something in addition to or beyond human. It's a specific way of talking about them and seeing them. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Another aspect that I was shifting again, but then feel free to go back and forth, is I was particularly stricken by the conception of art in Marxism and just representation, or just even the freedom to pretty much express yourself through art, and individualism and ruling material force. And you include the quote of Marx in German Ideology, that the class that is the ruling material force of society is at the same time the ruling intellectual force.
Yes.
And I was thinking, maybe in terms of surrealism, how surrealism maybe, or well, one of the goals, if we accentuate Salvador Dali, who was Habida Dollars, his famous motto, would be the exception surrealism to this
yes.
thought.
I think Marx is generally right. Those who dominate material production also dominate spiritual or cultural production. I think that's generally true. But I think that Marx's criticism, sometimes my own work, I think has been too pessimistic in that respect. Because, of course, there is no such cultural dominance without resistance. If there is, if that wasn't the case, one couldn't explain the whole phenomenon of the artistic avant-garde, of which surrealism is simply a part, although a very dominant part. I think radical critics, cultural critics, have sometimes not sufficiently seen the field of culture as a field of struggle. They tended rather, and sometimes in my own work probably, tended rather to see a kind of more monolithic model, of a dominant culture. No dominant culture, and this is very much what my old mentor Raymond Williams, I think, believes, that no dominant culture is able to exhaust or delimit or constrain the whole of cultural and spiritual production in a society, so you're bound to get contradictions, and then the question is simply how are these managed, how are they negotiated?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, go ahead.
And that's particularly important, I think, in Freudian studies and surrealism, for that extent, how the oniric tries to represent the pure nature or the unmediated nature of the ego. However, if the world of the ego is dominated by materialist forces, naturally it's going to have some sort of projection upon that.
Yes. Well, I think the conjuncture of surrealism and Freudianism is important in many ways, one of which is that it begins to generate the idea of what you might call the social or political unconscious. It collectivizes the unconscious and it sort of socializes it, so that Jameson's title, The Political Unconscious, is a late inheritor, in a way, of that tradition, that one can now talk about the unconscious underside or dimensions of society And I think that was a genuine gain by the left. You know, I mean, again and again. I mean, avant-garde figures, but also Benjamin and Adorno and so on, Marcuse, introduced a radically new dimension into our thought, our political thought, which then made previous political thought look very two-dimensional. And that there were, particularly in France, I mean, all the way from, you know, the Collège de France through Bataille and so on, there was now a whole new conception of cultural politics that explodes in '68, but doesn't disappear there. You know, sometimes goes underground and so on. So yes, I mean, the 20th century, as opposed to the 19th century, is marked by, on the left, by a politics for which, for good material and historical reasons, culture is now absolutely central. It's no longer just the window dressing. It is an area of combat, and a vital area of combat in its own right. And as I've said so often, I'm bored by it myself, and no doubt my readers are. Nationalism, revolutionary nationalist movements are the key there, because of course for them culture in every wider sense of it is absolutely vital. I think there was a genuine shift there in mid-20th century, early to mid-20th century.
That, I guess, radically came to a halt because of the wars, and it could be seen in modernism, maybe even more poignantly. The development of these ideas.
Well, it did. Although the revolutionary nationalist movement survived on, of course. Let's say their demise was more like the early 70s or something, and then an important brand of what you might call cultural politics that had really been politically revolutionary came to an end. Cultural politics didn't cease by any means. Indeed, in certain ways it gathered strength, not least because of the media society, but it was no longer as politicized in that way. And I think that then is one of the many conditions that paves the way for postmodernism. The cultural radicalism continues, but now in a certain divorce from political one.
Speaking of continuing with the discussion with art and 19th and 20th century, you define Marx as a romantic thinker with a suspicion of the abstract.
Yes.
Because it's simple and futureless, and a passion for the concrete and specific, which is rich and complex.
Yes.
However, how can we reconcile this with the romantic idealism, or romanticism investment with sort of these impulses and in a way abstract, not defined?
Well, I think because the paradox of romanticism there surely is that it is abstract. I mean, it's very concerned with the universal spirit and transcendence, but where it differs from the Enlightenment, let's say from Enlightenment rationalism, is it now locates that at the heart of the concrete. In a sense, that's the symbol. The symbol is a bit of concrete, bit of the world, which is invested with this universal spirit. So I think that part of what makes Marx possible is the fact that before he emerges, there's already been a coming together of, if you like, the concrete and the universal, or the individual and the universal. And of course much of Marx's work, as I say, Marx is concerned with the sensuous particular and so on, revolves around what are really romantic questions, but he does see that those questions themselves are symptomatic of real historical phenomena, and in the end, romanticism, idealism, are attempts to resolve those problems, but not, as it were, on the ground. You know, Marx adds the crucial extra element there.
It'd be interesting to give more exposure to Marx's creative output in literature and see how, if some of the characteristics of romanticism go along this idea, they serve as an output for its more...
Absolutely. Yes.
Sadly, they don't take hardly anybody pays attention to.
No, absolutely. It is a great shame. It is, yes.
Moving on, in connected with these ideas that you define, and I think it's very, very smart to define communism in which everyone would be encouraged to develop their individual talents as the characteristics as diffuse, diverse and unpredictable. It would be more like a modernist novel than a realist one.
Yes. Adorno once said, in connection with that actually, he said that a socialist society would by no means be a totality. I think he was making the same point, not a totality in the integrative way. What I should have gone on to do, but didn't at that point, is illustrate that with a bit of William Morris, because I think William Morris was supremely important English, one of the very, very few English revolutionary thinkers, and I think Morris would have agreed with that whole emphasis upon the pluralistic expression of individual creativity. Mm-hmm. I think that's how he would have defined communism.
And maybe in narrative also, you mentioned Thomas Hardy as well.
Yeah.
Could be a good example of this idea.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yes, I mean again at Hardy's the point where you can see that realist totality cracking at the seams, coming apart at the seams under various pressures, and I wouldn't say Hardy himself was exactly a modernist, but certainly is then paving the way. Yeah, it's a point where realism has been pushed as far as it can go. It's sort of hanging on. It's trying to negotiate certain problems that in the end it will only be able to confront by going beyond realism itself. Hence the great explosion of the avant-garde around the First World War and so on.
Mm-hmm. Which it's great, this definition of Hardy as some sort of the bridge between movements, because there's a great misconception of modernism and Marxism. They pretty much share the same. Everything seems to be these days that everything's modernist.
Yes, that's right.
I contend that at least in poetry there's a huge debt to French symbolism that seems to be the blueprint, rejection for the romantic excesses, for the realist representation of reality, for the big narratives in the novel. So, speaking of modernism, and going back to your Exiles and Emigres, back, like I think it was 1970.
Does anybody remember that?
Oh yes, and because that not only remember, but I think it shares something that is fundamental to define, and something that to actually establish a backbone of this, in my opinion, uncontrollable modernist myriad of anything is modernist.
Uh-huh.
And modernism never sort of died or extinguished itself.
Yeah.
It belongs to, which is a way of looking at it. But on the other hand, I think modernist does necessitate a backbone of characteristics. And your book focused vividly on that idea. That at least all of the main protagonists of modernism were outsiders.
Yes, in a strange sense, the book was almost like an anticipation of post-colonial theory before before the word was used. I was working. I didn't have that elaborate conceptual framework to work with, and I was fumbling my way. But some of the insights of the book I actually do anticipate. They prefigure that.
However, I think it would be not. I mean, I agree, but from a post-colonial studies, it would be arguable that, number one, we have male, white, except for Virginia Woolf.
Yes.
Elitist, T.S. Eliot.
Yes.
You don't have your typical post-colonial subject.
It's a very Anglo-centric book.
Exactly.
It's a very Cambridge book. I was still labouring under those influences. Raymond Williams was part of the way out of that for me. But of course Raymond himself was actually a very Cambridge figure. He might have been a left-wing version of that, but his work doesn't often move outside English literature, for example. So there was... I was still the unwitting victim of a certain kind of parochialism.
But I would like to argue that. I mean, it serves as a blueprint for worldwide modernism.
Yes, it can.
Take for example, Hispanic Modernismo, and there's been a huge division in modern studies because of the language.
Yeah.
But we pay attention to books like yours, in which sort of outsiders created this renovation. The same can be said of Rubén Darío and many other authors who were from Nicaragua and then changed the face of Spanish
Sure.
literature.
That's right, yes.
But because one's in English and people focus on the wasteland more than Prufrock or earlier poems by Eliot, for example, which have great depth to French symbolism.
Right.
And
yes.
So that's that's one thing that I think is so useful here.
Yes. Well, that's good. I'm enheartened to hear that. I do think, however, it's significant, perhaps, that the only point where I really begin to write about, as it were, world literature or comparative literature is it's almost as late as the book on tragedy. See, that's a sort of break in some ways, because then the very topic itself leads me into a whole set of national cultures and traditions and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was a kind of break around then where I was finally transcending these rather chafing limits, cultural limits. And from then on, I think my work became more cosmopolitan in some way. Yeah.
And other thinker that you include Wittgenstein, and he could also be put side by side with your essay on modernism, in which his family relations, and there's critics in Hispanic literature who pay attention to this in philosophical investigations.
Yes.
Include that this could be a good way of looking at modernism globally.
The family relations.
Family
model.
relations.
Yes, it is. It's an extraordinarily productive model. I've just got a book. I've got a book coming out in early next year, I think. I've always got a book coming out called The Event of Literature, and in a way, it's a return to sort of high theory. Really, it's going back to some of the problems I thought were unresolved at the time. The theory flared up, and then other things really took over. Mm-hmm. Certain questions got buried. But one of the questions I'm going back to is the what is literature question. In the light of the family resemblance model, I'm actually using that model to try and cast some light on the very phenomenon of literature.
Especially when in modernism, when language itself is so problematic. And
yes.
It seems to go underneath that, the notion of the representation of language, be it English, French, Spanish.
Yes.
And go to the actual, some sort of a palimpsestic way of it, and go to the root being the experience of being an expatriate or using French as a sort of lingua franca.
Yes.
And in that I think it works well.
Yes, yes. So the other aspect of this for me is the Irish connection, because small nations look outwards. Joyce is the nexus between Ireland and the world. Nowadays it's U2 or certain films.
Colin Farrell.
Yes, Colin Farrell or Brendan Gleeson, who once acted in my play about Oscar Wilde, actually. Mm-hmm. But there is, of course, that you get a very different viewpoint from the periphery there. My own connection, as it were, with post-colonial realities is through Ireland. That's the way I can best understand them. And what happened at a certain point in the 1990s, I think, was I then began to write directly about Ireland, which was my own particular way into those questions. I think of modernism, cosmopolitanism, exile, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'd like to just talk maybe about other aspects that we mentioned before, and especially about you as a thinker. And postcolonialism occupies a high rank in your critique of postmodernism. And how is it related to Marx's concept of agent, of doing, of actually physically moving?
Yes. I suppose I always felt one of my major criticisms of postmodernism, as you know, was that it didn't really have a theory of agency. And that seemed that's to say, in the act of getting rid of an objectionably autonomous sort of subject, it wasn't able to replace that with a subject that was truly an agent, but was really rather was diffuse in the sense of being rather passive and so on. There was also, feeding into that was a certain kind of Lacanianism, I think, because there is a problem there. That on the one hand, a valuable deconstruction of the subject then still leaves open a gap about the political subject, of which Lacan wasn't really very concerned. Mm-hmm. So I did think that, and that, in fact, many of the concerns with the subject in postcolonialism were concerns more with identity than with agency. There was a kind of paradigm shift, in a sense, there. And yet, also, that I think that makes historical sense, because you might say that postcolonialism is what takes over from revolutionary nationalism. In revolutionary nationalism, you certainly had the concept of the agent. You had to, the political and the collective agent. In a more disenchanted period, when those erstwhile revolutionary nationalist nations have tried and failed to go it alone and find themselves inexorably caught within the logic of world capitalism, a new movement starts up, and I think that's postcolonialism. In other words, I think that postcolonialism needs to look at itself much more historically and to see that some of its failures, for example, to engage with the question of agency and to shift it to identity, actually stem from that politics, that historical period. But it's quite reluctant, one's always reluctant. As I've said before, one historicises everybody but oneself. I'm not sure that Homi Bhabha would sort of take that critique on board,
On the other hand, there seems to be like a rise of classical philology, especially in certain regions in Europe, that particularly bonds Marxism and postmodernism, and is unable to separate them. And I talked to colleagues who asked Marxist / postmodernist, what is the ideology of something like a hendecasyllable, for example? That question alone is one of the attacks on Marxism put together with postmodernism, which, as you just clarified.
Yes. Oh, I see that they're attacking both from that position.
Yeah,
they're conflating
exactly,
the two. Yes,
exactly.
Yeah, I think that
the
is.
question would be, what is the ideology of a sonnet, for example, or the ideology of a iambic pentameter?
Yes, the ideology of form. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Well, I mean, I think that it's probably important to modify my own critique of postmodernism by reminding us that there has been a radical form of it. There are radical forms of it, particularly in the States. There have been. I mean, there have been very conservative forms of it here too. But in the absence of other kinds of, say, socialist traditions, that it's sort of tried to be a placeholder to some degree.
I mentioned it before, but one of your trademarks is the use of humor in your writing, and also of wit. That reminds a lot of a long tradition of Irishness. Quoted Shaw, could be Jonathan Swift, and of course Oscar Wilde. And why is it so uncommon in these days, or at all in literary theory, the use of humor and the use of wit?
Well, I suppose pressures of the institution is one example, I think. I mean, apart from the fact that quite a lot of critics just aren't very witty anyway. It's a rather banal response to this. But I think also, the pressure of the institution. I mean, in my own work, I think it was only probably with the book on Benjamin, which was, 1981 or something, that it wasn't particularly a matter of humour, but it was a certain more deconstructed or laid-back sort of form I felt able to do. That was certainly for me at that time to some degree the influence of feminism and its proper objection to a certain sort of very male academic earnestness, what I sometimes call the YMI, the young male intellectual. And I suppose I was at the point where I was receptive to a sort of critique of that, and that had to reflect itself in one's style and forms of writing. So I would say that it began to germinate probably around there, but that and then gathered a pace. But I think also by that point, I wasn't having to get tenure. I wasn't having to convince anybody. So I was relieved of those sorts of pressures, which I imagine, particularly in the States, contribute to a certain kind of rather grim-lipped, humorless people who write books with 200 pages of notes. And particularly the failure of that, even when those guys are on the left, their failure to question those academic forms. I think I was looking for new forms of writing, I don't think it was just a matter of humour or whatever. I was looking for, that was part and parcel of it. And it was also at that point I began, I suppose, to turn towards so-called creative writing.
Yeah, but I think the question is what everything should be about, especially in higher education, in academia, questioning one's beliefs, questioning everything.
Yes.
At the perils of losing one's identity.
Yes, sure.
Pecuniary
but
profit.
It does take a certain courage, I think. And I was lucky in the sense that I was really beyond that point. But I do think that there's a lot of there was at that time probably still a lot of leftism being poured into the existing academic mold, particularly in the States, where where the sense of the profession is so powerful. I mean, we don't tend to have that sense. Thank God, and the failure to question, even with somebody who I admire as magnificent as Jameson, who I admire so deeply, Fred's, for example, not really a public intellectual in this country, in the way that even somebody like Stanley Fish, a much more lightweight figure, is. Fred has always been within academia and not really seen the need to reach out in that way. Perhaps it's a different political situation, but I think that I very much value the residual public sphere in Europe, which meant that one could try and think and write beyond academia. And for me, part of that was really, I suppose, in the late 90s, the move into theatre, because I've said this before, but I mean, theatre is it's a wonderful humbling of the autonomous intellectual, because the playwright is by no means the most important person, because you're working with a collective, because you're working experimentally and provisionally. In other words, it's much more like a laboratory. I think it's very different material conditions of intellectual production, I think, and I benefited enormously from that, and that I think was my part of my putting more daylight between myself and conventional academia. Leaving Oxford whenever I did that, 2001 I think, was part of that too, because having been elected to a chair there, I discovered to my dismay that I was really being expected to be some kind of senior manager. Even Oxford was becoming managerialised, and I sort of refused to do that. So yes, I mean, I think I was resisting those conventional pressures, trying to at that point.
You mentioned theatre, and we can finish with this reflection on theatre. With scarcity, accentuating the overture to St. Oscar, would you begin with this brilliant sort of poem?
The song,
exactly.
The Song of Oscar Wilde.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even if your critical writings are amply devoted to poetry, you never wrote poetry. I know it's kind of a...
Actually, I did, but when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge, a lot of what I did was write poetry, and my great ambition as a working class, student, semi-outsider, was to get published in the posh Cambridge Granter and so on, which I did actually after a bit of striving. I then more or less stopped writing poetry, partly because I found it too hard, and I found critical writing absolutely as creative. So I didn't, as far as it felt, I didn't experience any difference between the forms. What then happened was that I really abandoned poetry for songwriting. See, the songs of the play come out of the fact of at Oxford we had a sort of Irish musical session every week, and people wrote songs, satirical, political songs, and I discovered I could do that, and I enjoyed doing that. I even sang them. So I suppose I did begin by writing, but I was never a poet, but I began by writing poetry, and then discovered it was quite as creative and really rather less trouble to write. and then the move into song and theatre followed that. So it's something of a cliche, of course, these days to talk about the deconstruction of the creative and the critical. You know, whereas I think there is a distinction between writing about a novel and writing a novel. You know. But as far as, as it were, experientially speaking, I discovered that I could get an enormous fulfillment and gratification out of writing, which is, I think, the major reason why I write so much, because I don't need to do it particularly. You know, I could stop, I could, you know, but go and look after cows and sheep somewhere. But I think that I also think, and I think I've said this before, that Roland Barthes talks somewhere about kinds of people who are. He makes a distinction between, I think, an écrivain and an écrivain. An écrivain is somebody who writes for specific reasons. An écrivain who writes for the sake of writing, and who, to that extent, doesn't care very much about what he writes. That's very true of me. What I write is much less important to me than the act of writing. I mean, I did review poetry for many years, and found that very, very difficult. But I kept that going, and that was quite creative. So I think it's. I think some people just are writers in a kind of intransitive way. It's not so much the object of their writing that's important. It's also I think it also accounts for the way that I move between, you know, if you like, more journalistic and more academic or specialist writing, because the forms don't matter to me so much. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's pretty much about it. Thank you very much.
Not at all.
Hopefully the questions were not
repetitive.
I would take nothing more than just asking the same.
Not at all. No. Most interesting. Let me have a copy of the journal when it comes out.
Absolutely.
And.